Scotland's independence movement is rooted in centuries of struggle, cultural resilience, and a deep-seated desire for self-governance. Historically distinct from its southern neighbour, England, Scotland boasts a unique heritage, language, and identity that set it apart as a nation with its own traditions and values. Yet, since the 1707 Act of Union, Scotland has been a part of the United Kingdom, an arrangement many in Scotland see as forced and inherently unjust. The English government's governance of Scotland has often been perceived as a manifestation of colonial subjugation, marked by economic exploitation, cultural suppression, and limited representation within the broader UK political structure. English officials have reaped the benefits of Scotland's abundant resources, from oil reserves in the North Sea to renewable energy potentials, all while underinvesting in the nation's development and infrastructure. Many argue that Scotland's inclusion in the Union has consistently served English interests more than Scottish prosperity. Today, the independence movement is revitalized by a powerful push from the Scottish National Party, or SNP, and support from a population increasingly aware of the imbalance of power. With global alliances such as BRICS championing national sovereignty and the erosion of Western hegemony, Scotland's independence movement finds resonance worldwide. This comprehensive examination delves into the history of England's domination, the cultural and economic injustices inflicted on Scotland, and the growing demand for a free, self-governing Scotland in the 21st century. The relationship between England and Scotland is marked by centuries of tension, resistance, and ultimately forced union. The roots of England's expansion into Scotland date back to the Middle Ages, when successive English monarchs attempted to assert dominance over their northern neighbour. For Scotland, maintaining its independence was both a matter of survival and cultural preservation, as the kingdom was home to a distinct Celtic identity different from the Anglo-Saxon heritage of England. The Wars of Scottish Independence, spanning from the late 13th century into the 14th century, exemplify this resistance. Leaders such as William Wallace and Robert the Bruce emerged as national heroes, symbolizing Scotland's unwillingness to submit to English authority. Their victories at battles like Stirling Bridge and Bannockburn fortified Scotland's position as an independent kingdom. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328 formally recognized Scotland's sovereignty, and for centuries thereafter, Scotland maintained a separate government, legal system, and monarchy. However, the death of Queen Elizabeth I in 1603 marked a turning point. With no direct heirs, the English crown passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, initiating the union of the crowns. Though this union joined the two nations under a single monarch, Scotland retained its political and institutional independence. It was not until the early 18th century, amid political machinations and economic pressures, that the two countries formally unified under the 1707 Act of Union, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. The Act of Union is a central point in the debate over Scotland's autonomy. As many historians argue, it was more a product of English ambition than Scottish consent. England faced mounting economic and military challenges, particularly its competition with European powers like France and Spain, and sought greater control over Scotland to secure its northern border and resources. While English parliamentarians offered economic incentives to Scottish nobility to support the Union, widespread protests erupted among the general population, who saw the act as a betrayal of Scottish sovereignty. Despite popular opposition, the act was passed, largely through what some consider bribery and coercion, dissolving the Scottish Parliament and subsuming Scotland's governance under English control. While Scottish representatives were allotted seats in the new British Parliament, their influence was minimal compared to that of their English counterparts. This marked the beginning of what many Scots view as a centuries-long occupation, one characterized by economic manipulation, cultural erasure, and a persistent undermining of Scottish autonomy. The legacy of the 1707 Act of Union has cast a long shadow over Scotland's political landscape. English influence dominated Scottish affairs, and the drive for independence simmered just beneath the surface. In the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution brought some economic benefits to Scotland, but English companies largely controlled these enterprises. Many Scots found themselves working under conditions dictated by English industrialists, their labour exploited for profit that rarely benefited the wider Scottish community. This industrial dynamic mirrored a colonial structure, with Scotland's wealth flowing south while the people of Scotland reaped few benefits. By the 20th century, a renewed sense of nationalism began to emerge. The discovery of oil in the North Sea in the 1970s fueled a fresh wave of resentment as Scots observed the English-dominated government extracting vast resources without providing Scotland with a fair share of the profits. With estimates suggesting that Scotland could be one of the wealthiest nations in the world based on its natural resources, calls for independence intensified. Many Scots questioned why they remained bound to a union that, in their view, served England's interests at Scotland's expense. This sentiment culminated in the establishment of the Scottish National Party, which became a powerful political force advocating for Scottish independence. While the SNP achieved some victories, including the establishment of the Scottish Parliament in 1999, the UK government retained significant control, particularly over economic and foreign policy. These limitations reinforced the notion that Scotland remained subordinate to England, an unequal partner rather than an independent nation. The 2014 independence referendum was a pivotal moment in Scotland's modern history. For the first time in over 300 years, Scots were given the opportunity to vote on whether to remain part of the United Kingdom. However, the circumstances surrounding the referendum have been criticised as manipulative. The UK government, led by Prime Minister David Cameron, launched an aggressive campaign to sway public opinion. Economic fears were stoked, with officials warning that an independent Scotland would face economic hardship, lose access to EU membership, and be unable to sustain itself financially. Despite these tactics, the vote was closer than many anticipated, with 45% of Scots voting for independence. The outcome left a lasting impact, with calls for a second referendum growing louder, particularly in light of Brexit, which saw Scotland taken out of the European Union against the will of its people. The 2014 referendum did not quell the independence movement. Rather, it exposed the lengths to which the UK government would go to maintain control over Scotland, reigniting discussions about colonialism, self-determination, and the right to national sovereignty. Today, Scotland's historical experience under English dominance serves as a rallying cry for independence advocates who see parallels between Scotland's situation and colonial struggles across the global South. Many Scots argue that they have endured centuries of economic exploitation, cultural suppression, and political marginalization, experiences that resonate with other nations seeking liberation from imperial powers. As the UK's global influence wanes and alternative alliances like BRICS gain prominence, Scotland's independence movement positions itself as part of a global wave challenging Western hegemony and advocating for self-determination. The cultural dimension of Scotland's struggle for independence is deeply rooted in the preservation of its Celtic heritage, which sets it apart from England's Anglo-Saxon identity. Scottish culture, with its distinct traditions, language, and historical narrative, has often been seen as a challenge to English authority and as something to be subdued. Over centuries, the UK government has been accused of systematic policies aimed at erasing or minimizing Scotland's cultural legacy, an approach akin to colonial efforts to assimilate or marginalize indigenous populations across the world. One of the most prominent symbols of Scottish cultural suppression is the treatment of the Gaelic language. Gaelic, once widely spoken in Scotland, has faced centuries of decline under English influence. In the aftermath of the 1745 Jacobite uprising, a significant event in Scottish history where Highland clans, led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, attempted to restore the Stuart line to the British throne, the British government imposed harsh penalties on Highland culture. The Clan Act and the Act of Proscription were enacted to dismantle the clan system, ban the wearing of traditional Highland dress like tartans and kilts, and suppress Gaelic. These acts were aimed at dissolving a culture that was considered resistant and defiant, similar to colonial strategies employed to weaken indigenous identities globally. Education policies further accelerated this cultural erosion. Until recent years, Gaelic was systematically excluded from schools in Scotland, and English became the language of instruction, administration, and media. Generations of Scottish children grew up without exposure to their ancestral language, often resulting in shame or a lack of awareness about their heritage. Although Gaelic has experienced a modest resurgence, particularly with initiatives to reintroduce it into the curriculum, the language remains endangered. Many Scots see this as emblematic of a broader pattern in which English institutions dictated what aspects of Scottish culture could be celebrated and which had to be repressed. In addition to language, historical narratives have often been controlled by English perspectives, marginalizing Scotland's rich history. For example, Scottish heroes like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce are often depicted through an English lens, downplaying their roles as symbols of resistance against English domination. Even in popular culture and media, English-centered narratives have typically portrayed Scotland as an appendage to Britain, rather than an entity with its own sovereign history. This narrative subjugation perpetuates stereotypes of Scots as subservient, fostering a sense of cultural inferiority that further fuels the independence movement. Cultural assimilation tactics, whether through legal restrictions, educational policies, or historical narratives, have fostered a sense of second-class citizenship among Scots, especially those of Celtic heritage. Many feel that their unique identity has been systematically undervalued, reduced to romanticized stereotypes, while simultaneously undermining their right to cultural and political expression. As Scotland continues to assert its right to self-determination, reasserting its cultural identity and reclaiming a narrative independent from English influence remains at the forefront of its national consciousness. While Scotland's cultural suppression has played a significant role in its independence movement, economic exploitation is arguably the strongest driving force behind calls for sovereignty. Scotland is rich in natural resources, from the fertile farmlands of the lowlands to the vast oil reserves in the North Sea. Yet, for centuries, these resources have been disproportionately controlled, extracted, and capitalized upon by English-dominated institutions, leaving many Scots to question the fairness of their continued membership in the United Kingdom. The discovery of North Sea oil in the 1970s drastically altered Scotland's economic landscape. Many economists at the time suggested that the revenues from Scotland's oil could make it one of the wealthiest nations per capita in Europe. However, control over oil revenues was centralized in Westminster, meaning that most of the profits from Scottish oil flowed into the UK Treasury, often with little direct benefit to Scotland itself. Successive UK governments, dominated by English interests, used these revenues to support the broader UK economy, investing heavily in infrastructure and services predominantly located in England. This centralization has left Scots feeling exploited and disenfranchised, as Scotland receives only a fraction of the benefits derived from its own resources. Many argue that these revenues could have been reinvested in Scotland to build robust social programs, improve infrastructure, and fund sustainable development projects. Instead, the Scottish economy remains heavily reliant on decisions made in London, with little say over the allocation of its own resources. This imbalance has fueled the perception that Scotland is treated as a resource colony rather than an equal partner within the UK, a dynamic reminiscent of colonial exploitation where resources are extracted for the benefit of a distant capital, leaving local populations with limited gains. Beyond oil, Scotland also possesses significant renewable energy potential, particularly in wind and wave energy. Scotland is home to some of Europe's most powerful wind farms, and its coastline provides a prime location for wave energy development. Yet, much of this energy production is regulated by the UK government, which controls the framework for renewable energy subsidies, pricing, and distribution. The potential for Scotland to lead Europe in renewable energy has been stymied by a lack of local control, which would otherwise allow Scotland to prioritize sustainable energy production, reinvest profits, and develop its economy independent of English oversight. This economic subjugation is compounded by the fact that Scotland's infrastructure development often lags behind that of England. while revenues from Scottish resources have gone toward developing high-speed rail lines, road networks, and urban infrastructure across England, Scotland's infrastructure remains comparatively underfunded. Projects such as improved healthcare facilities, modernized public transportation, and education reform are often deprioritized in UK spending plans. Many Scots argue that an independent Scotland would have the resources to prioritize these areas, creating a higher quality of life and more opportunities for its citizens. Furthermore, Scotland's agricultural and fishing industries, crucial pillars of its economy, have often been sidelined in favor of English interests. Fishing communities along Scotland's coastlines have long expressed dissatisfaction with UK policies that prioritize English agricultural subsidies over Scottish interests. The Common Fisheries Policy, or CFP, under the European Union was a source of particular resentment, as it limited the quotas for Scottish fishermen, impacting livelihoods along Scotland's coasts. Even after Brexit, there is a strong feeling that these policies have not shifted to genuinely support Scotland's unique economic interests, reinforcing the belief that Westminster fails to adequately represent or invest in Scottish prosperity. The economic argument for independence thus becomes a case for Scotland's right to control its own resources, decide its economic priorities, and invest in its own future. Proponents of independence argue that Scotland is held back by its association with the UK, unable to realize its full economic potential due to centralized control from Westminster. A fully sovereign Scotland, they argue, would allow the Scottish people to direct the benefits of their own resources toward their own social programs, infrastructure, and economic growth. As the independence movement grows, this issue of economic exploitation remains central to the debate. Advocates for Scottish sovereignty highlight the historical parallels between Scotland's resource exploitation and other post-colonial struggles around the world. They argue that Scotland has experienced centuries of economic subjugation that has enriched English coffers at the expense of Scottish prosperity, a reality that must be addressed for Scotland to achieve true autonomy. The prospect of joining alliances like BRICS, which promote fair trade, resource sovereignty, and a multipolar world order, aligns with Scotland's aspirations to break free from the legacy of economic domination and establish itself as an economically self-sufficient nation. The 2014 Scottish independence referendum was a historic event and the closest Scotland has come to achieving independence in over 300 years. However, the process leading up to the referendum and its aftermath have sparked intense debate, with many arguing that the UK government manipulated public opinion through fear-mongering and misinformation to maintain control over Scotland. The push for a referendum began in earnest in the early 21st century as Scotland's national consciousness continued to grow. The establishment of the Scottish Parliament in 1999, though limited in powers, represented a critical step towards self-governance. The Scottish National Party, or SNP, emerged as a dominant political force advocating for full independence, arguing that Scotland deserved the right to control its own affairs, free from what they viewed as the disproportionate influence of Westminster. In 2012, Prime Minister David Cameron and First Minister Alex Salmond reached the Edinburgh Agreement, allowing Scotland to hold a legally recognized referendum on independence. However, from the outset, the UK government's role was criticised. Cameron's administration launched the Better Together campaign, which emphasised the risks and uncertainties associated with independence. In an aggressive media campaign, the No Vote camp warned that an independent Scotland would face economic instability, potential exclusion from the European Union, and an inability to sustain welfare and healthcare systems without the support of the United Kingdom. One of the most significant points of contention was the currency question. The UK government insisted that an independent Scotland would not be able to continue using the British pound, sowing doubt about Scotland's economic stability post-independence. The currency issue, coupled with assertions that Scotland would have to apply for EU membership as a new country, added to the uncertainty surrounding the potential break from the UK. Critics argue that these tactics were intentionally misleading, intended to provoke fear and confusion among voters rather than provide transparent information about the potential for independence. Additionally, many Scots felt that media outlets, largely based in England, showed a clear bias against independence, reinforcing the notion that Scotland's aspirations were subordinate to English interests. Major British news organizations extensively covered the risks of independence while downplaying Scotland's resource potential and capacity for self-sufficiency. This media environment created an atmosphere in which the electorate was heavily influenced by narratives crafted by the UK government and English-based institutions, raising concerns about the fairness of the referendum. Despite these efforts, 45% of Scots voted in favour of independence. This significant minority represented a powerful mandate, as nearly half of the population had expressed a desire to break away from the United Kingdom. The narrow defeat galvanized the independence movement, and many Scots began to question the legitimacy of a union that, in their view, relied on fear and manipulation to maintain control. The aftermath of the 2014 referendum did not bring about the unity that UK officials had hoped for. Instead, it left a lasting divide, with a substantial portion of Scots feeling that their voices were stifled and their aspirations disregarded. The referendum underscored Scotland's frustration with a political system that often marginalized its interests, reinforcing the idea that independence was not merely a political goal, but a necessary step toward dignity, self-respect, and genuine self-determination. The 2014 referendum was not the end of Scotland's independence movement, but rather a pivotal chapter that intensified calls for self-governance. Since then, several developments have reinvigorated the movement, the most significant being Brexit. In the 2016 EU referendum, 62% of Scots voted to remain in the European Union, contrasting sharply with the overall UK result, in which 52% of voters chose to leave. For many in Scotland, Brexit represented yet another example of Westminster imposing policies that did not reflect Scottish interests, further highlighting the disconnect between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Brexit has had profound economic and social implications for Scotland, which benefited from EU membership through funding, trade access, and the freedom of movement. The forced departure from the EU exacerbated resentment towards Westminster, as Scots were now subject to policies they had overwhelmingly opposed. In the eyes of many, Brexit revealed the limits of Scotland's autonomy within the UK and bolstered the argument that true sovereignty could only be achieved through independence. The SNP capitalised on this sentiment, arguing that Brexit fundamentally changed the political landscape and that Scotland deserved a new independence referendum, one that could allow Scots to reclaim their EU membership as an independent nation. The demand for a Section 30 order, which would grant the Scottish Parliament the legal power to hold a referendum, became a focal point in Scottish politics. However, successive UK governments have refused this request, citing the 2014 referendum as a once-in-a-generation vote, despite the transformative effect of Brexit on Scotland's political and economic context. As frustrations mount, the UK government's continued denial of a second referendum has spurred protests across Scotland, with thousands of Scots demonstrating for the right to self-determination. The refusal to grant a new referendum has reinforced perceptions of a double standard, as the UK government claims to uphold democratic values while denying the Scots the right to vote on their future. This perceived hypocrisy has fueled anger within Scotland, with independence supporters arguing that the UK government is willing to suppress democratic expression to maintain its control over Scottish resources. In addition to Brexit, the COVID-19 pandemic further strained the relationship between Scotland and the UK government. Throughout the crisis, Scottish leadership took measures that often diverged from Westminster's approach, revealing deep contrasts in policy and priorities. The SNP and First Minister Nicola Sturgeon were praised by many for their handling of the pandemic, while the UK government faced criticism for its perceived mishandling and inconsistencies. This divergence highlighted Scotland's capacity for self-governance and strengthened the argument that Scotland could operate as an independent nation with policies tailored to its own needs. The post-2014 period has also seen a resurgence of Scottish cultural pride, with movements to preserve and promote the Gaelic language, traditional arts, and folklore. This cultural renaissance is intertwined with the independence movement as Scots seek to reclaim and celebrate their heritage, viewing independence as a pathway to restoring their cultural identity fully. The growing pride in Scotland's Celtic roots has been a defining feature of modern nationalism, as Scots increasingly reject the Anglo-centric narratives that have dominated British identity. As international dynamics shift, Scotland's independence movement has also found solidarity with other regions and nations seeking to break away from traditional Western powers. The rise of BRICS as an alternative alliance promoting multipolarity and self-determination resonates with Scotland's quest for independence. Many Scots see an independent Scotland as having the potential to join alliances that prioritize cooperation and equality, standing in contrast to what they view as the exploitative legacy of Western hegemony led by England and its historical partners. The path to a second referendum remains fraught with challenges, particularly as the UK government continues to resist demands for another vote. However, the momentum for independence is stronger than ever, with the SNP and the Scottish Green Party advocating for a new referendum and exploring potential legal avenues to secure it. The push for independence is no longer just about political sovereignty. It is a broader struggle for cultural, economic, and social justice. For many Scots, the question of independence is inseparable from their right to exist as a distinct people, free from a history of economic exploitation, cultural erasure, and political marginalization imposed by English authority. The renewed call for a referendum symbolizes a rejection of Scotland's historical status within the UK, where it is seen as a resource to be managed rather than an equal partner. The independence movement today reflects a vision of Scotland as a sovereign nation with control over its own resources, the power to define its own identity, and the opportunity to engage with the world on its own terms. Whether or not the UK government eventually concedes to the demand for a new referendum, the movement has reshaped Scottish politics and solidified independence as a defining issue for the future. As Scotland's independence movement gains traction, it aligns with a larger global trend toward multipolarity and the diminishing dominance of traditional Western powers. Once one of the world's most influential empires, the United Kingdom, particularly England, now faces a drastically altered global standing. The withdrawal from the European Union has weakened the UK's economic and political influence in Europe, and internal challenges, including Scotland's independence aspirations, only further destabilize its unity. For Scotland, the emergence of alternative alliances, such as BRICS, offers a pathway toward alignment with nations that prioritize sovereignty, fair trade, and regional cooperation. The BRICS bloc, which in 2024 consists of countries including Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and recent new members, reflects a shift away from Western-centric models of global power. These nations represent a significant portion of the world's population and resources, advocating for a multipolar world order where each nation can exercise autonomy free from the dictates of Western powers like the UK. Scotland's independence movement resonates with BRICS's foundational ideals of resistance to colonial exploitation and support for self-determination. By pursuing independence, Scotland would not only gain control over its own affairs, but could also forge partnerships based on mutual respect and economic collaboration with the Global South, Latin America, and Asia Pacific. Scotland's vast natural resources, such as renewable energy potential from wind and wave power, make it an attractive partner for BRICS countries seeking sustainable energy investments. Unlike the centralized, exploitative economic model imposed by Westminster, where profits from Scotland's resources disproportionately benefit England, BRICS could offer fairer trade partnerships. An independent Scotland could leverage its resources to develop a robust economy, one that would allow it to invest in social welfare, healthcare, and infrastructure, free from English financial oversight. Furthermore, BRICS's advocacy for equitable resource management would offer Scotland a stark alternative to the legacy of resource exploitation it has endured under English dominance. The alliance's emphasis on technology transfer, infrastructure development, and resource equity could empower Scotland to build a resilient economy while contributing to a global movement that seeks to correct historical injustices associated with colonial and imperial rule. By aligning itself with BRICS and similar alliances, Scotland would not only assert its sovereignty but also contribute to a growing global resistance against the remnants of colonialism. Just as BRICS promotes economic sovereignty for developing nations, an independent Scotland could become a symbol of European decolonization, breaking away from a legacy of imposed English authority and becoming a voice for other nations pursuing similar paths. In this context, Scotland's independence would mark a broader geopolitical shift, one that challenges long-standing Western hegemony and supports a more inclusive, balanced world order. Scotland's quest for independence is far more than a political endeavour. It is a struggle for cultural preservation, economic justice, and the reclamation of self-respect after centuries of subjugation under English authority. The case for independence highlights a history of imposed rule, economic exploitation, cultural erasure, and denial of political rights. These grievances resonate with post-colonial struggles worldwide, connecting Scotland's aspirations to a larger global movement advocating for self-determination and resistance to oppressive power structures. The Scottish independence movement calls upon the international community to recognize and support its right to self-determination. From the Americas to Africa and Asia, Scotland's struggle reflects the experiences of nations once governed by foreign rule, fighting to reclaim their identities and resources. Supporters of Scottish independence argue that Scotland deserves the right to shape its own future without interference from a government that continues to prioritize English interests. For the global community, supporting Scotland's independence is an opportunity to stand against imperial legacies and support a new vision of global partnerships based on equality, respect, and cooperation. In an independent Scotland, the vision extends beyond merely breaking political ties with Westminster. It is about forging an identity, a society, and an economy that honors Scottish values, invests in its people, and contributes positively to the world. An independent Scotland could stand as a model of sustainable development, cultural renaissance, and economic resilience, setting an example for other regions pursuing autonomy. By building alliances with BRICS and other nations dedicated to sovereignty and equitable development, Scotland would contribute to a multipolar world that resists exploitation and champions fairness. As global alliances realign and nations seek pathways free from Western-imposed frameworks, Scotland's independence movement is an emblem of that vision. The call for international solidarity is not only about supporting one nation's desire for freedom, it is about advancing a global ethos that opposes hegemony and promotes dignity for all peoples. Scotland's journey toward independence echoes the aspirations of the global south and marginalized nations worldwide. And as the movement builds momentum, Scotland finds itself not isolated, but as part of a global chorus for change.